Welcome, everyone. Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Casey. I am the Associate Director of Graduate Career Services here at Tufts. This is always a privilege to be able to have a conversation about career-related topics like this. This one is certainly front of brain. I imagine, for the coming spring and thinking about opportunities and how to think about your value and communicate this, communicate that in traditional environments, and certainly with the pandemic, how do we adapt our styles and expectations to a new world with new technologies and new techniques. I will say what's great about interview prep and strategy is that predominantly those skills and techniques remain the same. So we're going to go through a bunch of them today. So let's get started. So before we get into the nuts and bolts, and many of you who have seen presentations before have seen some of these slides, so hopefully they'll be helpful refreshers. But I imagine many of you, if not all of you, recognize this brand. And when we think about a brand like this one, things that I've heard are efficient, competitive, convenient, technology, somewhat inexpensive. I've also heard not a great reputation, legislation, California, employees. So a variety of different ways to sort of think about who this organization is and what they represent to us as individuals. And I would say the same thing for this brand, where things are similar, convenient, ease of use. I've heard less expensive. I've heard more friendly. I've heard more accessible. I've heard the brand with the mustache. So these are two competing companies in the same space. So this is not an exercise in brand strategy and awareness. But what this is if we understand our own preferences, our own understandings, our own experiences with brands. So, and those come from how we engage with them, what we learn about them, how we work with them, what other people say about them. The exact same process that you use to discern between two brands in the same category is exactly the same process an organization uses to decide between two qualified candidates for the same job. We are not saying that individuals are exclusively brands. It's just recognizing that it's part of our story and part of who we are and part of what we represent. So from a career strategy and planning standpoint, what we want to help our graduate students do is how do we help you become the preferred candidate for all the positions that you seek in your career? Interview preparation and execution is definitely one of those pieces. It's one piece of when you're directly engaging individuals, either virtually or in person, and having a dialogue about your fit and engagement with that role and the value that you can contribute. So I think this is an interesting paradigm, but a way of thinking about interview planning and yourself and the components that make you and why that's important for an organization. This is probably the most important slide, or one of them at least, that I tend to share, and just making sure everybody recognizes is that career planning is a process. So when we're having dialogues in presentations like today, we're going through an exercise of understanding what has to happen from a process standpoint to get from yourself to the ideal opportunity you're looking for. And everybody falls along this continuum at any given time. Sometimes you fall in multiple places. Sometimes you currently want to be successful in your existing job, but want to transition to something else. But from a career planning and strategy standpoint, with the career services department and the career center, is that we are here to help meet you where you're at. So we have tools and resources and expert coaching in each of these areas to help you out. For this conversation today is clearly around interview preparation and making sure just everybody knows that preparation matters and that interviewing is most definitely a skill. It's something you can learn and something you can practice to get better at. So I think recognizing the fact that it doesn't have to be unsettling or always feel extemporaneous is that you can work on these answers, and a lot of the conversations of the work we're going to go through today is how to think about that. The very most important thing, the first thing in the career the career planning process, the most important part about the interview process is you. And I think that may go without saying, but how to think about you is absolutely critical. So what we want to help people do is, how do we understand the complexities of our who we are, not just professionally, not just academically, but in holistically. What information are we looking for? What do you need to understand about yourself? And then how do we figure out what to do with it? So this is a personal inventory discovery form. This is a way to try to simplify and categorize the complexity of who we are. Each of these categories represents an element of a position. And each of these elements of position can be assessed in a position description and evaluated in comparison to you. This information, if understood, makes the rest of the interview planning process easier. Why is that true? Aside from industry-specific technical questions, every interview question you will ever get in your life will come out of these 6 categories. So what information is essential to understand? One is interests and passions in the first box. That is, what do you like? What do you love? What are you connected to? What's intriguing to you? And like I said before, these are not exclusive to your degree, and they're not exclusive to your professional interests. This is across the board. If you're interested in fishing, great. If you're interested in ballet, great. If you're interested in human development, fantastic. So it's recognizing things that are interesting, that you're curious about, that you like to engage and participate in. It also can recognize things that you are not interested. One of the great things about this framework is it's not based on everything that has to feel positive. The idea is starting with an exercise of recognizing what you do not like or is not working is just as an effective technique to sort of capture information as what you do. The next thing in the next box 2 is skills and competencies. What are you good at? What are you great at? What are you great at and never want to do again? What would you love to be doing but want to get better at? So this is sort of inventorying sort of skills and competencies. And when I think about competencies, I think about things we can do. Market research, policy analysis, quantitative methods. I think of skills as the tools you use to accomplish those competencies. So market research, Excel may be the tool that you use. It is purely semantic, but it's a framework of thinking. This is a way it's capturing, again, not just about your academic and professional environment, but things that are you. And it's hard and soft skills. When I talk about hard skills, about things you can do, like using Excel. But some might say soft skills are things that are less quantifiable. So you might have a skill where it's being collaborative or creative, or maybe leadership or management. So this is a place to capture that information. Usually this is where people stop thinking about career planning and process and looking at, well, am I interested in this opportunity and can I do it? But that does not exhaust the nature of what a role is. So what we're trying to do is say, here are the other things that are really critical and important to be evaluating to maximize not only your happiness for the role you're looking for, but the ease in which you can communicate who you are and the value you can create for the organizations when you're interviewing. So the third one is attributes and descriptions. This is, how do you perceive yourself? How do others perceive you? How do you think they perceive you? And how would you ideally like to be perceived? So these are sort of brand attributes. These are the ways that people would describe you. And this is a question that could certainly come in an interview, is that, if I put your friends and family in a room and ask them to describe who you are, what would they say? Or if I put your colleagues in a room or your managers, what would they say? So this is a vocabulary that you assess, you align with yourself, and that perhaps other people. And the reason I ask, how do other people perceive you, is that oftentimes the clearer alignment between the vocabulary, between your perception of yourself and how others perceive you, a lot of times the better fit for the role that you're in, and the easier it is to communicate who you are and your fit within that opportunity. Next thing is values and motivators. What is important to you? What is critical to you? This can be from an ethical standpoint. This can be from a moral standpoint. This can be from a personal standpoint. It's, do you value integrity? Do you value honesty? Do you value Um, competitiveness. Do you value environmental responsibility? So these are things that are connected to, a lot of times connected to the organization and the people who work within that organization, because you may find a role that's ideal. The job fit well. I'm interested in the opportunity. It aligns with my goals and expectations. But this particular organization is polluting oceans, and this is something that's antithetical to what you believe in and what's important to you. So the idea is that recognizing that there are, just because the role work doesn't mean the whole system or the whole piece or the whole idea of what the thing you're looking for is going to work for you. So it's just making sure that you can measure what's important to you versus how another organization, what they care about, and how they're behaving and acting and valuing those things. This next one is critically important, and one we tend to not ask as much, is styles and preferences, particularly around work. How do you like to work? How do you like to work with others? How do you want others to work with you? What's the ideal working situation? How do you like to lead? How do you like to be managed? What's the worst boss you've ever had? So this is the conditions in which you want to work. If all the other parameters of the job look great, but this job requires 50 hours a week behind a desk working on computer programs, and you don't want to spend 50 hours a week behind a desk, you want to spend 90% of your time in the field talking with customers, even though you might be great at doing that job, the long-term engagement or excitement within this role may be limited based on your preference and how the execution of what you're doing every day. So really thinking about, and we don't always know exactly the way we want to work, but I think, thinking about how you like to work now, how you like to study now, the people you like to engage with, the management that you tend to work with, how you like to be led, and how the situations in which you can grow. The last category is goals and expectations. Is why are you doing all of this? Like, what is important to you? So, what do you want to accomplish personally? What do you want to accomplish professionally? What kind of time horizon does that look like? This is, I think, can be broken down personally and professionally. So you're thinking about, do I want to buy a house? Do I want to have a family? Do I want to retire at 30? Do I want to find enlightenment? Do I want to? And usually tend to break these down into sort of like, 0 to 1 years, 1 to 3, and 3 plus. I tend to focus more on the shorter term, even though keeping an idea of what ideally ideals are for the longer term. Just for the reality is how often 5 years is such a dramatic difference for most of us, and how often many of us don't have the same job with the same roles with the same experiences. But the thing is, it's why you're doing what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish out, because that can dictate a lot of the elements of what you're trying to get out of your work. Because if you're trying to retire at 30, finding a job that allows you to earn the compensation that's consistent with what you want to retire on is critical, and and can you align all these pieces? But what this really helps people understand, at least myself included, is that it's not one lever that dictates one job preference over another. It's all sorts of them. It's hundreds of levers looked at a different time. And we'll go through that framework in a second. But this exercise is iterative. It's conceptual. You can do it on your own term. But if you understand these things about yourself, everything else in the interview process is easier. So interview basics. You are interested in an opportunity. Why does this help us out with interview preparation? So this is an example of the position description. This one happens to be for diversity, equity, inclusion program manager. This position actually existed. I imagine it's filled now, but it was an actual open role for a company in Boston. So this lays out all of this information. But what's really fascinating about a position description is it really just is an amalgam of those 6 categories on the personal inventory form. So what we want people to be able to do is to be able to look at a position description and be able to deconstruct it by its parts and then evaluate them. So this is the information on this position description. This is a framework for breaking down that position. So how do I look at the information and what they're looking for, and how does it match me? So this is a framework. This information on this page under responsibilities and job duties are directly taken from the previous slide. So each of these boxes has information like taken verbatim for the previous slide. So in this particular role, and typically with a position description, organizations are asking for, they usually prioritize the most important things that they're looking for responsibility-wise as the first thing that they're listing, and then the second and the third and the fourth, typically. So in this particular case, we're looking for lead our cross-functional DEI working group, create overarching DEI strategy, et cetera. So what I'm asking people to think about is, one, how well do my skills and my competencies match this role? And if there are gaps, what would I need to do to become the ideal candidate within this responsibility? And used as sort of a scoring set, a scoring framework of like 5. So if your skills and experience are perfect, it's a 5. If they're a 1, that means there's a long way to go to get exactly what they're looking for. But at least we understand what that is, and that can evaluate the specifics of what's necessary to grow and to achieve what they're looking for. But the other thing we want people to ask themselves is, how interesting is the thing that they're asking me to do? So just because I can do that thing, do I want to be doing it? Because if your interest level and the most important thing they're asking for is a 2, and these are still subjective numbers that we evaluate, that you would be adding, or a coach could help you do these things. But it is a more objective way of checking viscerally what you feel about that particular experience. So what this is doing simultaneously is evaluating, can I do the job, and do I want? Will I enjoy doing it in that space? And the same thing can go for qualifications. So this is what the expectations of what this person should have to do this job. A lot of times they start with how much work experience. Do you have the 5 years of professional work experience that they're looking for, and the 3 in the categories that they're interested in? This doesn't mean you have to have a 1-for-1 experience. It doesn't mean you have to have had this job before you do this job now. It's recognizing what other transferable skills might you have. Like if you've got 4 years of leadership experience in DE&I at Tufts across 4 different groups, building leadership teams, building things, doing the actual work that's consistent with something like this, those are transferable skills and things that match. Again, and sometimes the intersection matters, sometimes it's just a fact. But what you'll notice as you go down these categories is not everything is a skill or competence, or a skill or a hard skill or an interest. A lot of times it can be a soft skill. In this particular case, we're looking for an excellent collaborator. Well, how do we measure that? Well, you've worked in team projects, you've worked in group projects, you've worked, across time zones. So it's just recognizing that it's going to draw information from each of these 6 categories. What we've created is a matrix to evaluate an opportunity. So what this matrix is designed to do is to look at any opportunity, and then by those 6 categories in the personal inventory form, you should be able to evaluate you versus that category, score that category, and come to a sum. This is not about an aggregated score. It's not about, the highest numbers are helpful, and they can be helpful in context of other roles. But what it does allow us to do is really get specific about the elements of this role and how you fit into those things and what's important to you. It also allows you to evaluate for things that aren't scoring as high, what would have to happen to increase that score. So what it allows you to do is help you target roles that may be more aligned with you. But this exercise makes the interview process much easier because you've done all the work, because you've done all the research, you've done the introspection, you've matched it to the role. It doesn't mean you have the answers packaged yet, but it means that you've connected it mentally between you and the value that can be created within that role. And from a career services perspective, this is something you can do. We can help you with it. It can be part of the process, but really, in summary, it just means the due diligence, the front end work that you've done strategically makes it easier to start building the communication strategy to land the job that you want. So then we get into the interview process. So now that you've applied for this job and you find out that they're interested and they want to start a conversation, usually that conversation starts with a phone screen. Doesn't always, but oftentimes. It usually is a representative of a human resources department who are doing preliminary screening questions about your candidacy. So it's not necessarily going to be in-depth technical questions. It could be questions about what's your interest in this? How did you discover this? What are your expectations for the roles? what's your timing. Sometimes they might ask, what are your salary expectations? My recommendation under most conditions is to not discuss salary until an offer is made. And one of the reasons it's incredibly difficult to negotiate if both parties don't have the information required to negotiate on those things. If you have questions about that or the phone screens, we can certainly, in the career services department, we can have a discussion about what that might look like. But I would say, if you're having a conversation, a compensation that's consistent with my level and my capacity to do the job. So once that happens, the phone screen, usually the hiring manager, or sorry, let's say the HR representative, communicates the hiring managers, the person that's trying to hire for this job. And then a set of interviews are set up. And interview structures they come in a variety of options. Sometimes they're one-on-one conversations. One time it's one interview with one person once. One time it's one interview with one person 2 or 3 times. A lot of times, for a lot of in a lot of places, there could be a combination of interviews. It could be, initial interview with a hiring manager. The second time you come back, you meet with 2 colleagues and a manager. The next time you come back, you might do a case study. The next time you might do a panel. It really depends on the organization and what they're looking for from their candidacy. So there really is a variety of frameworks in which to be interviewed for a role. Lastly, number 4 is the negotiation part. This is when you're like, they want to offer you the job. How do you get through a process of how does this role match, and how do we maximize what they will provide you, and what how do they maximize what they get out of you? So recognizing there's a lot of different styles, a lot of different places. So depending on what you're applying for, there are going to be different expectations for the organizations that are in their interview process. 60%. 60% of an interview is non-verbal, which means 60% of the time, nobody's talking. That's an interesting way to think about a connection. So recognizing is that an interview is not just how you're communicating verbally, your value, your interests, your expectations, your alignment for the role. It's everything else. It's eye contact, it's body language, it's posture. It is the way, the way you might take notes, the way you might sit back in your chair, the way you may pause and answer questions. There is no perfect way to interview. There's no perfect style in these places, but recognizing is that practicing those elements becomes very, very critical. Now, what's interesting is in this 2-dimensional virtual world, a lot of these things are slightly different. You don't have a 3-dimensional space. We can't see how you're crossing your legs, or how you're sitting in your chair, or the notes that you're taking, but you can recognize eye contact. So from a career planning and management standpoint, with a career center, is not only be able to help in an in-person interview, but really how to manage in a virtual space. So just being cognizant of those elements becomes very, very critical. This is most definitely true. How you prepare, including how you dress, is critical. For in-person interviews, understanding what the expectations of the organizations are and dressing based on those expectations for those roles. Not every organization has an expectation for formal attire to interview for a role. For instance, creative agencies or advertising agencies are a very good example. And a lot of times there is an informality to an in-person interview where, jeans are acceptable. Like, it's the style in which you're going to work. It's how you present your personal brand aesthetically. But in the absence of that, I would defer to the most professional attire you can. And this is one thing I want to mention. This is a place to make an investment in your apparel, and recognizing that things can get expensive, but the idea is make the investment in the clothes for the role that you're looking for. So making sure they fit, making sure they're tailored, making sure it's polished, making sure your tie knot is appropriate. This could be in person, and it seems that it might not be as important for an interview in a virtual landscape, but there is sort of the subconscious psychology of getting yourself mentally and physically prepared for this opportunity and how you want to think about yourself in the way you're presenting yourself. So thinking about the fact that you might very much want to wear the suit or the formal attire in your seat while you're doing the virtual interview, because that's the setting in which you're delivering your brand. So if you ever have any questions about what that might look like or how to prepare for that, certainly the Career Services Department can help with that. One of the things important, particularly in in-person interviews, is a handshake. And in the US, a firm handshake when greeting somebody with direct eye contact, not a very loose handshake, not an overpowering, but firm. It will be interesting to see in the future if this is a common reception for individuals in the future. But historically, firm handshake, direct eye contact. So we had mentioned the virtual landscape and how often this is the protocol. And for this foreseeable future, I think a number of positions are going to be directly virtual in their interview preparation. This happens to be an article from Psychology Today, which I think is a really interesting organization to frame this, is understanding the environment in which you want to create to optimize the external perception of your preparation for this opportunity. So I'm not going to go through this list in an exhaustive way, but being well lit is important, having and being able to look this up to realize that, either setting your workstation up in front of a window so you have direct sunlight, or having a light source in front of you that's illuminating your face in a sort of a natural way is perception. Making sure the sound works. Maybe it's headphones. Buying a microphone can be very effective. Eye contact is critical. So where you center your information, being able to prepare for looking, where you put somebody's image on the screen to look at them directly versus getting information. Framing yourself, so where your head is in the screen. What's behind you is absolutely incredibly important to understand. A lot of times now it's easy to put a virtual background, putting something that is, I would say, simple or elegant or easy, but not having a lot of distractions, not having a lot of things that could be read, or things that the interviewer could be looking at something else other than you. Dress is important, removing distractions, cleaning your desktop, and making sure, and I know it makes sense, but making sure your Wi-Fi connection or whatever your Ethernet connection is working effectively. There is a level of flexibility with connectivity. There's a reality to the world that not everything is going to mesh and not everything's going to work perfectly. So just recognizing the fact that one glitch in this system is not necessarily, or probably unlikely, to demonstrably hurt your candidacy for a role. So making sure that you prepare effectively ahead of time, making sure these things work, making sure you do your practice, but things do go wrong. There is a level of understanding now that may have been different in the past. So then we get into common questions. So how do I answer the questions? Which ones are going to come to me, and how should I prepare effectively for them? Before we even get to the questions, is that what are the essentials that when you're getting to the point where you're starting to ask questions and getting ready for that experience. One, as I mentioned very early in this conversation, is interviewing is a skill, and practice does make perfect. So whether or not you are talking to yourself, whether or not you're writing down questions, you're talking to a mirror, you're using some technologies that I'll show you later, you're working with Career Services to go through mock interviews, which we do all the time, under the conditions that you're in. So if you're doing behavioral interview questions, we can do those. If you're doing case ones, We have opportunities to support that. We have individual coaching. We have third-party resources. So ways for you to adequately prepare for those conversations. The next thing is absolutely critical: doing your research on the organization that you're going to engage with and the people that you're going to talk with. So what does the organization do? What have they been doing? What's in the news about it? What's interesting about the products or services that they offer? What's interested about what's happening in the marketplace related to what they do? If you know the people that you're interviewing with, going to their LinkedIn profile and looking at their backgrounds. What do they do? What school do they go to? What kind of work do they come from? How are they describing themselves? What kind of summaries do they have? So understanding, getting an idea of some of the background of the people that you're working with, that become very effective as you're having a conversation, is being able to be relatable. Is that an interview is most definitely a conversation, and it is not a race. This is, an interview is a dialogue between one or more people. The organization has a need and is trying to fill the need. They're trying to fill that need with somebody who has the expertise and the resources and tools and the skills and the attitude to do that job. The individual is trying to find a job to do what they love to do, or pay their, earn a salary, pay their bills, meet their goals. So the idea is that it is not a unilateral conversation. It is definitely bilateral. It's definitely an organization and individuals trying to understand how well the candidates can meet the needs of the organization for this particular opportunity. So pace becomes helpful. It's not about answering the question the fastest. It's not about trying to get through it quickly. It is about making sure everybody has enough information at the end of that conversation to move forward one way or the other. This is very, very critical, and probably one of the most important parts of the interview process. When asked a question, always completely answer that question, the one that's asked of you. Even if the question that's being asked doesn't make sense to you, seems irrelevant to you, not being able to connect the dots, recognizing it's not the job of the individual to try to understand the intent behind the question that's being asked of the interviewer. There could be any number of reasons. It could be a canned question they have to ask. It could be one that they're just personally interested in. It could be one they're testing you with. Whatever that is, however you start your answer, as long as you resolve that answer with the answer to the question that they're asking, you'll be in good stead. Because I think, with interviewing, it can be anxiety inducing. It can be a little nerve wracking. And so the idea is that when that happens, it's easy to go off in tangents. It's easy to go sort of think about other things and not try to circle back. This is a way to remember, is that you need to be able to circle back to what the answer is. And this is important amongst, I suppose, all of the things that we're talking about important, is that yes, organizations are interested in your credentials. Are they interested in your certifications? Are they interested in your degrees? Are they interested in your work experience and professional experience? Yes. But really, organizations are trying to understand or trying to perceive what value you have or what value you've created historically, and why are you interesting to us? So what we want to make understand from an interview process is, how do you demonstrate your value, and why do you demonstrate how you're interesting and relatable? That's a helpful construct to understand, is that in a framework and a sort of a boundary of understanding of what's important for a job and how to frame the questions or the answers to the questions you're being asked. So what questions, if any, do you worry about being asked of you during an interview? There are a number of questions. Again, actually, they're limitless. There's a number of different ways to answer questions and ask questions. But what's really interesting is that sort of that personal inventory framework we started, is that there's a lot of different ways to ask a question, to ask the same thing. So just being able to remember is that just because it sounds different or they've asked it in this interesting way, They are still trying to assess your skills, your interests, your values, your styles, your work expectations, your attributes. So you have a document or a framework to draw information. So, how you'd be able to recognize questions and what they're actually asking, and then be able to give the answer they're looking for. But one of the big ones people get nervous about is, tell me about yourself. That can feel like an overwhelming question. From a career coaching and strategy standpoint, we think this is an amazing opportunity, because what the interviewer has just done is give you complete control of the answer. So there are a number of different ways to frame, but what I think a lot of the time speaking is just leading with, a reverse chronology. Like, I'm currently a student at Tufts University studying mechanical engineering. I've focused on these things. Before that, I did my undergrad at this place. I did 2 internships doing here, and before that, done this, and this. That can be very helpful. That usually is captured on your resume or your CV or your cover letter or your LinkedIn profile. Recognizing that telling about yourself can be an opportunity to frame that conversation. So one thing to frame is your interest in that role. So if you're applying for an opportunity, you don't have to lead with your credentials necessarily. You can lead with the fact that, if this job is for a mechanical engineering role, the idea is that I have loved building new things from scratch with miscellaneous parts since I was 5. And the idea of being able to construct things at scale in these organizations and these things that are interesting me are exciting. So what's happening is that after that first thing you say, I guarantee the next thing you say out of their mouth, they're going to be paying direct attention to, because now you've given some window into yourself, into why we're having this conversation, of why it's interesting, that there's some synergy between what they do and what's interesting to you. We can help frame that. But one of the things I think is helpful is that as you're framing the tell me about yourself, it doesn't have to be exclusively about your academic or professional life. You can bring in pieces of your personal life if they're relevant, or things that value that you want to introduce. I do think it's helpful, though, is when you're answering a tell me about yourself question, is to be able to bring it to a resolution. So however you answer that question is that, I believe it's my technical expertise, my interest in what this place is doing, and my desire to work with people that want to solve complicated problems is really what's incredibly excited about this opportunity. And I'm glad to be having this conversation today. So just recognizing is that it doesn't have to be a regurgitation of your biography in this question. It can be a way to tell them why you're valuable, why we're having this conversation. The other thing is, why do you want to work here? Again, this is where doing your research becomes helpful. What have they been working? What are they doing? Do you know somebody who's worked there and they told you great things about it? You can share that information. Are they doing leading edge work? Have you read something in the news that's great and that's bleeding edge? But I think being intentional, and making sure, recognizing in an interview is the interview is not about you. The interview is about the organization. So what you're trying to do is, why do you want to work here? Is the background context is that I want to help this organization succeed, and I want to have a good time doing it, ideally. So, but being specific about why you want to work and doing the research is important. And it could be very specific, a research module, or just it could be something around the culture and the people and how they like to develop talent. But really, it's making sure you're connecting it to what they do and how you want to contribute. Why are you looking now? This certainly happens as students, but definitely as you become professionals, this is going to be asked probably often. Again, doesn't have to be a scary conversation. And it doesn't, usually it's about, it can be about the value that you want to create somewhere else. Is that, I've had an amazing time working for the institution that I'm at, or I've reached a level in my place where I'm getting ready to graduate and I want to directly apply, these skills or these opportunities within this role. So as a student, I think it makes sense. I will be graduating, or I am currently a student, and if it's an internship, I'm looking for this role right now. As a professional, it depends on the conditions, and the conditions might be you do not like the job that you're in, and that's fine. That's probably not something I necessarily communicate. I'd lean towards the fact that you're looking for another opportunities. And then ideally, the one you're looking for, the conversation you're having, is the ideal role that you're looking for. So making sure that they know that this is, even though there might be 1,000 other roles you're interested in, this is for this purpose, for this conversation, is that this is the ideal opportunity that you are seeking, and the timing was fantastic, and you wanted to pursue it. Number 4 is always one that comes up, is what are your biggest weaknesses? I don't happen to be a big fan of this question. I don't think it actually gets to the answers that people are looking for. But it's, it's asking you, when you self-reflect, where do you feel like you're not, you want to achieve better, or where do you feel like you're deficient? This is not a question that you have to answer and turn into a positive. That's a framework people oftentimes speak of, is that, well, here, this is my biggest weakness, but this is how, but I've done all this and I've made it better. There are sometimes that your biggest weakness can just be a weakness, and you do the best you can, but it doesn't always work out the way you want it to. And there is the humanity in those conversations. For instance, in my particular role, the bulk of the work is, individual coaching and presentations, which is something that I love. But there is a component of this job that involves, event planning and programming. These are things that I find much more difficult and not a natural skill. The organization and the process and making sure that everything is coordinated effectively can be very frustrating. But over time, I've learned to be effective at it. But I found, in order to be successful, is finding colleagues that are great at doing this, and making sure I build relationships and supportive ones, where if it's possible to offload some of that responsibility or do it in collaboration, I find the results are much more effective. So the idea is that, event management and planning is not something that I'm going to want to evolve and develop, but I'm making it work under these conditions. That can be true of a lot of things, but you don't necessarily have to say I fixed something. But if there are conditions when you are improving, but making sure the weakness you're talking about is something real. And everything is real, but making sure it's something that people can connect with is good. Like, if your weakness is being a perfectionist or excelling, like, it's a hard thing to sort of gravitate to somebody, like you're doing too well, or you're executing too much. But the idea is, like, if the biggest weakness is I take on too much responsibility and get overwhelmed quickly. Great. Then how does that manifest itself, and what are you doing about it? These are questions that we can certainly help you work with and navigate and find the answers to them that you might want to communicate in an interview. And the last thing is, why should we hire you? There is an interesting framework called the Rule of 3. The Rule of 3 is sort of it's a psychological framework in which when information is communicated, people tend to absorb information in groups of 3. This is a place where that can be helpful. So we're talking, why should we hire you? You're trying to communicate information from different areas, why you as a human being are really, relevant and related to this role. So, why should we hire you? I have a strong technical background in these particular areas that relate well with this job. I have, 3 years of experience working in business work in these areas, doing these things. And from the time I was 5, I've wanted to work and have worked on complicated problems like this, and have developed a competency, and have worked tirelessly to be sitting here right now. So I believe for these 3 reasons that I'm aligned and fit for this job. And should the opportunity, and should my candidacy continue to be desirable, I would love to work here. Is always making sure in the conversation that you're letting the interviewer know in the interview that you want the job. I know these are just conceptual frameworks and examples. There are ways to practice all of these questions, but these are typically a lot of the big ones. One of the big that comes out right now, and this happens all the time, are behavioral interviews. So these behavioral interviews are questions about scenarios and conditions. So give me an example of a time when this happened. Give me it, and there's a list of 10 of them in this particular slide. Show me an example where you're able to motivate a coworker. Give me an example of how you set goals. Tell me an example when you had conflict with a peer and how did you resolve it. So there is a method that is one approach to answering some of these questions called the STAR method. The STAR method is situation, task, action, and sort of result. So the idea of way to frame a behavioral question is what's the situation that you're in? What are the conditions that the conflict exists? Sort of what did you do? How did you evaluate what you do within that system to resolve that? And what was the outcome? But here's the thing, again, this is where the outcome doesn't always have to be positive. It could be, how did you achieve it? That the outcome effect is that we didn't collaborate, or we had to work separately because we identified that there was specific dissonance in our styles and expectations and our needs. And that was the most effective choice for these pieces. So just recognizing the fact when you were asked situational questions, understanding what they're asking, and that there's one of many methodologies that you can use to respond to that. But what you're trying to do is say, this is the situation, this is what I was doing with it, and this is the outcome that existed or we desired to achieve. At the end of every interview that you have, it is always expected, unless specifically said otherwise, that you will have questions to ask. It looks favorably on a candidate if you don't have any questions. The idea is that there's no information that the organization or people you're talking with can provide you that would give you glean more insights into that role or that opportunity. So having questions prepared are critical. Here are just examples of ones you can ask. One of the questions people love to ask is, what's the culture like? What is it like to work here? What we're trying to do is say, if you're going to ask questions of individuals, give them structure to make it easier to answer. Because if you're asking an individual about culture, you're going to get their own perspective of that place, but they have to interpret what culture means and what that looks like in those pieces. And you may or may not get the information that you're looking for. They may or may not feel comfortable giving that information. I think more specific questions can glean the same insights, but in a way that's packaged more specifically for the audience. So, in this case, in your experience, what are the characteristics of the most successful new hires here? So you're asking the interviewer for them to give you their impressions of what success looks like in the form of an individual who works in that organization. So by asking that question, they're going to tell you, what skills do we desire? What are our values? What are the work styles that we prefer? What kind of goals do they set? They're going to give you attributes of those people in those discussions. So they're actually going to give you the information that you've been giving them. So you end up getting more of a colorful picture of a situation, and it's also telling you what their expectations of success are. The next two are similarities, is especially if you know who you're going to be interviewing for a role. For instance, if they give you a list of people and you've done your LinkedIn research, let's say somebody's been at the role for 5 to 10 years. What is it about the organization that's kept you here for the last X amount of years? So again, it's the same thing. You're asking that person to tell you why they've made the choice to be where they are, and they could give you any information about skills or attributes or styles or expectations. But recognizing the fact that not all the answers you're going to get are going to be positive. They could be like, I have to be here, or you might get somebody's preferences or their humanity in those conversations, which can be just as enlightening. So what you've done is you've given somebody a structure to give you a ton of information fast. Conversely, if somebody's only been there a very short time, you can ask it the same way. As you recognize you made this change to this new role in the last 6 months, what was it about this role that made you want to change? And how is it, and how have you enjoyed it so far? So 3 examples of many things that you can glean a lot of information from that looks professional. I just bring this slide up for an interview conversation because it comes up all the time. People ask me, hard skills, but what are the soft skills that organizations are looking for? These are 2 buckets of soft skills from 2 different sources over the last year about what types of organizations are looking for, and things you can embed into the conversations that you're having in an interview. From a pretty substantial LinkedIn research project that they did, organizations are looking for creativity and persuasion and collaboration and adaptability. Or for this other one is a complex problem solving and people management. So recognizing if these are the type of soft skills that organizations are looking for, can you embed these themes into your responses. Because yes, it's critical to be able to do the job, but people want people that can not only do the job that they're in, but a lot of times grow into other options or grow into other roles. Last part is closing the deal. When I started a coaching business 10 years ago, and prior to that, I worked for 5 years for a large biotech firm in Cambridge. When that was happening, the second to last interview that I had was with a senior product manager, and it went well. And she said, "Are you meeting with Mike after this?" I said, "Yes." Mike was the senior vice president of sales and marketing and was the number 2 person in the organization. And she says, "You're going to have to close him." And I was like, "I'm sorry, I do not know what you're talking about." She's like, "Mike has been selling to organizations for 25 years, and he's as good at what he does as anybody in the business. His job is to understand customers, divine their needs, and then ask them for their business. If you don't ask him for the job, he will not give it to you." And that's stuck with me for a long time. So the idea is that whenever your interview ends, and I mentioned this earlier, is making sure that you ask for the job. Not only are you telling them, "This is why I'm valuable, this is why I'm interesting, and this is why I'm relatable," you're saying, "I would love, should the opportunity present itself, I would love the opportunity to work here." So the last thing that people have in their minds, whether or not they ask you for that last bit of feedback or you volunteered at the end, is the last thing they have in their mind is you just asked them for the job and that you're excited about it. That can, and oftentimes is a huge differentiator and can put you at the top of the pile if you weren't already there. Quickly on follow-ups, being able to send, always send thank you messages. It used to be you'd send them by, a card or, a thank you card or a handwritten letter. That's not necessarily necessary now. My recommendation is all the people that you met on an interview day is making sure that within 24 hours, you have sent out a thank you message, ideally the same day, if that can work, and personalize it. So when you're interviewing, it's completely fine to take notes. I'd be discreet when you're, not discreet, but being conscious of the fact of your body language when you're doing that. But if you talk to 10 people, ideally, and can you get their email addresses, because nobody's sending out business cards anymore. But if you have that information, you have notes or have something in your memory that's unique about the conversation you had with them, so you can refer back to that in your personalized messages. And again, saying thank you for the time, and I'd love to work here. If you have a longer time horizon, yeah, you can send the email address. You can also send a personalized message in a personalized note and send it in the mail. There's still something incredibly connecting about doing that. Should that scenario present itself, feel free to connect with us or talk with others whether or not that works the best. How long do you wait for a reply after your interview? Usually 10 to 14 days is a pretty good benchmark. That being said, in this modern pandemic marketplace, organizations and companies are all over the place. They have new demands, new needs, new changes. So being more patient in the time horizons for the organizations, and when you hear feedback, it's happening more often that you might not hear back from a company for 6 months, but there's something happened, but they're still interested in your candidacy and do you want to move forward. My recommendation is following up 10 to 14 days is good. I think if you don't hear anything, following up another 10 to 14 days is great. After that, another week is fine. But after the third reach out, say thank you. Should this opportunity continue to be open and my candidacy is desirable, I would love to work here, or something to that effect. And then you let them go. So like you've been diligent, you've been focused, you've been professional, but at a certain point you let them make the decision on their own terms. And again, it's conditional based on circumstances, but these are some pretty good guidelines. Very quickly is some rights. One of the things that's very important is, and this is true, it's definitely true in Massachusetts. I think it's national. Organizations are not allowed to ask you your salary history. And the very reason for that is that let's say this job, and you don't know yet, but this job is going to offer $100,000. but they ask you your salary history. And the last job you worked at, you made your last salary was $60,000. But what this is saying is that they're saying this job is worth 100,000. We're trying to find the person who can fill this job. By asking and you giving their salary information, they can say, wow, this is fantastic. We would have paid $100,000, but we'd love to pay less. Let's give this person 10% more than they were offered before, and we'll get them for 70. It's illegal to do that now. It's now hired based on the salary being offered for that role, not based on historical context, but based on perception of value. There are a number of different lawful and unlawful interview questions and examples that are available. This document will be shared with all of you soon after this presentation. So things that people ask about, your work status or your family status or your age, your disability status, and what's illegal to ask and how can people ask. So being prepared for some of these questions, those are things that we can help with interview preparation in career services. And here are some examples of answers to some of those questions. And lastly, I'll just mention is that we have a resource on the Tufts Career Center website available to all students, graduate and undergraduate, called Big Interview. This is a tool we actually had before COVID. This is a virtual interview preparation platform, and it is fantastic. It's incredibly robust. So what it allows you to do is go through the interview process from generic questions to very, very specific industry and technical questions. So it has categories by industry and sector and opportunities. But what it does allow you to do is to see examples of questions and how they've answered by somebody else. But it also gives you the ability to record your own responses. And there's an AI and machine learning backbone to this, which will actually give you feedback on 9 or 10 different categories. So you can work with an individual or practice on your own terms, but this is another tool you can use to prepare for interviews. I think this is a great tool to use. It could be just big questions because, it doesn't have to be an interview to be able to know how to answer these questions. Anytime you're networking or building relationships can be helpful. Thinking about how your answers might be to, even think about how you might answer a question, for a cover letter. So you all have access to this in order to get, go in the Career Development Center. There's a 4-digit code that you would add if you set up your profile, and you can start immediately. YouTube is an amazing resource for career planning and strategy. So it's one thing to be able to do the work on your own terms, one thing to talk with somebody else, but you can go onto third-party sites and see how other people are answering questions, or how do hiring managers, what questions do hiring managers ask of people that are looking for jobs that I have. So you can, it's another place to see examples of how to answer types of questions. We are excited. We have just relaunched the Career Services website. So if you've been to it before, you will see a very different aesthetic. We have Big Interview as a tool. We have other interview resources. We have resources around everything around the career planning process that are available. So we welcome you the opportunity to check out our site at careers@tufts.edu. We are still at Dowling. We are not in the office at all. All of our programming in the Career Center is virtual right now and will likely be through the rest of the academic year. But we're still offering the same services. We've had multiple career fairs. We're still offering presentations and programmings. And for those of you who have not or are seeking individual coaching appointments, we use Handshake. So you can set up a handshake with usually myself, through the Handshake platform. I always say if I've given a presentation and you don't see an opportunity on Handshake, is send me 1 to 2 weeks of your preferred availability, and I do my best to match it up to find time in my schedule to meet with you. So again, interview plan, preparation and strategy, it is a skill that can be learned and developed and taught, and we have the tools and resources, the expertise to help you navigate those spaces. So thank you so much for your time and your attention today. And I look forward to connecting with each and every one of you in the future. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.